Okay. So thank you all. What I wanted to do today was to have largely a group discussion on the tasks and duties that were identified in Act 173 as passed. These are in Section C of the bill. And just largely to check in with the members where you are, whether you had preliminary comments, recommendations, and if you didn't, what additional information you would like to see as we, start thinking more towards the report writing and trying to bring the group together to provide a recommendation to the legislature. I think what I'd like to do is maybe start with the members to go through where they are, if they have preliminary terms or recommendations, and if they don't, what additional information they would like to see. And I'll go through each committee member. I know some of you have all provided your comments and recommendations. So I'd like to maybe start with some of the group members we haven't heard from, and then come back to the ones that we have, just so that everyone's refreshed. And then potentially we can have a group discussion to see who we want to bring in for the next meeting to address some of the additional information identified, and talk about a little scheduling logistics at the end of the meeting. Jeff?
Thanks, Jeff. I guess I was just wondering if it might make sense, rather than to have each person go through with all of their comments, right? If we did it by section of the 6 duties that we've been assigned, if we kind of talked about subsection 1 and kind of tried to see where we could get to on that, and then the subsequent sections, it just strikes me that
I think
easier to follow.
I think that makes a little bit more sense, Jeff. That's a good
Okay.
Good to point that out. Yeah, so let's do that. So we'll start with section C1, the duty, development of baseline inventory of current and projected quantities, locations, and usage of diversions and transfers in the state. I can weigh in first on this just to kick us off. As I guess the agency may be the primary keeper of some of this information. The first meeting, we presented some of the baseline data that we have on water withdrawals in the state. It's limited, our inventory. It certainly isn't capture all the water withdrawals that are going on across the state. We know that. The only sector it does capture in any great detail is snowmaking, for the reasons we've discussed, and they're subject to the snowmaking rules and reporting requirements on Act 250 permits and other permits. So, I'd agree a water registration program is likely needed to track some of the uses across the state, to get a better handle of what the projections are. I would assume, just from the one who hears about the water withdrawals from our compliance and Fish and Wildlife, that there can be several of, or there may be numerous, depending on the current weather conditions, flow conditions across the state, whether water is needed for your, if David and John,
David, why don't you go first, and then I'll add anything. You're muted, David. David, just unmute.
as we pointed out in our comments, there's not adequate information. I think that agrees with what you and pretty much what I read in everybody's comments, that there's no registration, no real knowledge base. And so I guess we're suggesting that in fact we establish one, meaning a registry of some kind, and that because of that, our request is to hear from a jurisdiction that does have a registry program and how they operate it. I don't want to spend time reinventing the wheel if it's not necessary.
Yep, that sums it up. I agree.
Senator Bray?
Yeah, thanks, David. I think that's just the place where the legislature is coming from in that, if we're in an awareness phase when we hear anecdotes that are inconsistent or incomplete. So we said, okay, a helpful thing for us will be to just slow down and get our facts straight first before we, get moving.
Jeff?
I don't know if I'm supposed to raise my real hand or my virtual one. I'll go back and forth.
Either or.
Yeah, we're in agreement. I think that, there's limited information except for in the case of snowmaking, as was pointed out. And I think that, having some form of registration of existing withdrawals would make sense. I'm a little bit familiar with New Hampshire's water use registration, form and process. And I wonder, and I don't know, you may have a better sense of this, Jeff, than I, but someone from New Hampshire DES, whether someone could be available from there to just talk through how their program works. I mean, as I understand it, it's not so much a permitting program as it is a registration program. And, we could get into what the differences are between those two. But I sort of feel like as an incremental initial step, that to get some kind of registration going, and I think, Senator Bray makes that point, I think, as well. And I think it does, just to sort of understand, is this really an issue at all? Is there not much going on out there, or is there a lot more that we don't know about that could be captured through getting this registration program going?
Yeah, and I have talked to my colleagues over in New Hampshire. I think their program has evolved a bit. It's more than a registration program now. They do have the registration component, but then they also issue what they call certifications for water withdrawals to make sure that they're meeting their water quality standards. And I will have them in. I was hoping this meeting, but something came up, but we will have them in next meeting to discuss their program a bit with the committee.
Good.
Yep.
Jeff, do you know, is there some sort of minimum withdrawal that has to be registered? Maybe we'll find out in our next meeting. I was just curious.
It's for the registration program, it was pretty high. It was like 20,000 gallons over 7 consecutive days would be withdrawn. I've had the.
I was looking at that. Yeah. 20,000 gallons of water per day, averaged over a 7-day period.
Okay.
So
it's pretty high.
And are you familiar with other thresholds that any other states? I haven't really looked into it much to see if they're, obviously any state may have some kind of threshold, but I'm not sure how they differ.
Yeah, I think Massachusetts has 50,000 gallons per day. They all vary that I've seen. I think Minnesota was around the 10,000 gallons per day threshold.
Yeah, I think it would be really, I'd like to hear some, either hear from people or maybe someone could pull together, I don't know if this staff, like what the thresholds are. Very interested in Evan and Jeff as hydrologists and the agency experts in terms of, you know, how those thresholds, do they make, you know, some sort of an opinion on whether they make sense in Vermont, given, you know, Vermont's conditions in terms of water resources that we have, you know, as opposed to other states. It'd be really helpful to have that information and discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd also be interested in hearing from New Hampshire how that threshold number relates to maintaining their water quality standards.
Right.
Well.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's the goal, right? You know,
Yeah.
I think that showed up in, I think, most of the comments. You know, I don't think there's any disagreement that, you know, we want to make sure whatever is happening, whatever is being authorized, obviously has to meet water quality standards. So.
Yeah, and obviously it's a little different if you're taking, you know, a certain amount of water from the lower Winooski versus, you know, some small upland stream in the Green Mountains. So,
Right, of course, yeah.
they need to weigh in some kind of threshold discussion.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Evan, I think you had commented before, it was more about the backing a water registration program.
Yeah, I feel like my comments are very consistent with what folks have said.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
not much to add.
All right. Jason, do you have any comments on C1?
No, I mean, my comments are very consistent with that. The only comment I would say is I think that there's a differentiation between surface water withdrawal that is used for maybe irrigation versus surface water withdrawal that's used for snowmaking, as there's a return to the waterway when the snow melts, and there's probably a percentage, maybe credit or some way to calculate that is if there is actually withdrawal and a return back to the waterway. I think that should be contemplated, but I fully agree. I think it's hard to create regulations based on something we don't know exists or does exist or to what level it exists. So yeah, I mean, my comments were really aligned with everybody else, except for the one component. If there is a return to the waterway benefit or credit that could be evaluated, I think that would be useful or helpful to sort of evaluate or establish.
Okay.
And, so Jeff, Carrie Dolan texted me, and she can't get on.
She's on right now.
Oh, is she? Okay.
Oh, sorry, Carrie.
There she is, right? Yeah.
Just thank you, Jason. This is Jeff Nelson again. So on this, you know, obviously we recognize that when water is withdrawn for snowmaking, the snow eventually does melt and percolate into the ground and make its way back into the watershed. We've never really tried to take credit, if you will, for that, because it's really a different time. You know, the water is withdrawn during the winter months and it's not available to the streams and rivers at that point in time. It comes back later in the spring or early summer. So even though the water is in fact returned, so it's not consumptive in an overall sense, it comes back at different times, and we've never been, you know, we've recognized that that's not something we could necessarily take credit for because of that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, as with many things, timing is everything.
Yep.
Ryan, do you have thoughts on C1 duty?
Sure. Thanks. This is Ryan. Jeff, I just shared with you some summary information just before this meeting started. I apologize for the delay. What I've shared is a summary of a review of the 2017 USDA NASS agricultural census, as well as the 2018 irrigation census. And when the committee speaks about an inventory, I wonder how much more specific of an inventory does a policymaker need to be able to understand whether or not there exists a threat or a need for additional permitting beyond their current system. For example, what's reported is the total surface water reported being withdrawn by farms, estimated to be withdrawn from surface water sources, those being used on field crops and those being used within a greenhouse, and it provides a figure there. It provides information about the distribution of where farms are located throughout the state. So counties, which can generally be correlated to watersheds, so not specifically, but absolutely acknowledge that certain reaches of certain counties are different than the main stem or lower portion of the Winooski as far as allowable withdrawals before you get above de minimis. So I would suggest a committee, I believe we're study group, sorry, take a look at the citations there for both the ag census as well as the irrigation census. Some other information that's shared that I think is useful is 93% of farms that report irrigating are irrigating between 1 and 9 acres. So not a large amount of, large land holdings. Obviously it's all watershed specific. But I think the information in there is useful for a first cut analysis of agriculture's potential impact. Only 0.57% of all agricultural cropland and pasture land in the state is irrigated. So it's a very small portfolio in the agricultural space. And further, when you look even at the climatic variability and the min-max spread across all the months going back, that tool that the state climatologist shared, you still get precipitation. You can still grow a crop. How good that crop is, it could be impacted, but crop failures generally happen in Vermont from too much water as opposed to not enough using USDA the crop insurance reporting information. So I think, I'd for the next meeting, if folks can take a look at that and, trying to get a sense of, how much information, do we need, would be great.
Ryan, thanks for sending that. I just see that in my inbox. I'm going to forward it to the committee. It was just to me. So is that okay? So they all have it?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, there we go. All right, so I forward you the memo that was sent by Ryan. Thank you for putting that together.
Sure. I'll stop rambling now. Thanks.
Carrie, so we're just discussing duty 1, the development of the baseline and people's thoughts. I don't know if you would have some thoughts, recommendations, additional information that you would like to see as we move the committee's work forward.
Jeff, if I may.
Yeah.
This is Carrie.
Hey, Carrie.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate, hi, everyone. I appreciate Ryan Patch's comments. However, he was cutting it out and I couldn't fully grasp some of his conversation. If he has anything in writing it to supplement what he had forwarded to you, I would appreciate seeing that.
Okay. I've just forwarded you his memo.
Thank you.
So hopefully you'll receive that.
Okay.
I
And
think
the
if there-
citations to the original documents are in the footnotes, so feel free to click on those and they should take you right there and you can take a look at the data.
Yeah, and
USDA.
I think if people have additional questions,
Thank you, Ryan.
we can have a group discussion or group email chain chat, whatever, to try to make sure everyone's on the same page as people review that memo. Did you have any thoughts, Carrie, on duty one, or the development of the baseline, current inventory? You know, we've talked about registration programs and such. I didn't know if there had any other additional thoughts on this duty or additional information you would like to see as we move forward. People have talked about bringing in other for states that have registration programs as such, and talk about thresholds for that registration. So.
I do not. I do appreciate, I apologize for being late. I was having technical difficulties, but I think that baseline is much of what we're talking about is how to set in place the approach response to ensure into the future we have sustainable supply of water within basins and for our in-stream and other. And so having that appropriate baseline is critically important, but keeping that in mind and to something that Ryan has mentioned, as we see climate impacts on our resources and the likelihood of the unfortunate likelihood of drought during dry seasons and growing seasons, we may see a greater demand in our water resources. And so this baseline question is critically important to ensure that we're doing the right to ensure into the future that we can maintain a sustainable water supply.
Yeah, I thank you. One other question that, you know, around this that pops into my head is, you know, whether, and I don't know the answer to this, whether there's activities that currently are not in Vermont or low level Vermont that may be water dependent that aren't really fully captured yet in our inventory when we develop it, and, you know, potentially what those may be. I'm not certain, but, you know, maybe something for the committee to think about.
Jeff, I guess I'm just not clear on what you just said.
So, you know, if we have a baseline data we developed, is there uses that are dependent on water at a low level that may increase in the future, that we're not totally, you know, projecting the quantity that may be forced on our water withdrawals, you know, whether there's an industry or an agricultural practice as such that, you know, becomes more established in Vermont and more reliant on our water resources. That's just
I guess my view of that is that it seems like it relies on a lot of speculation. And if there's a threshold where if you are using, you know, X gallons a day, and there's a threshold that's set that, you know, if you're using less than that, you're using less than that. If you are using more than that, you're using more than that, and you have to register. And, you know, so rather than speculating what might happen to this particular farm or industry or whatever 10 years from now, if 6 years from now they're going to go over the threshold, they have to register or get a permit if and when they do. And I guess I would just think it's simpler than sort of speculating, well, you might use more, or you might, you know, I don't think people really know.
Yeah, I totally agree. We don't know. I just, you know, looking at duty one projected quantities is sort of a thing that's, you know, called out as a duty that we as a committee are tasked with kind of thinking about a bit more. And I don't know the answer, Jeff, either. And I think you raise a good point. You set the threshold, and you set the threshold thinking that these new activities may mean that they will be captured. But just kind of throwing that out to the committee as, you know, one of the tasks.
This is probably putting, you know, the cart before the horse, but I mean, when we get to a discussion about what kind of a program and what are the factors, you know, obviously a factor in my mind would be in terms of what the impacts are, or who else is using water from that particular source, if anyone, you know, because that affects, right, the cumulative impact of of the withdrawal if other people are also withdrawing and taxing the amount of water, but we could talk about that as we get down the line. But
Okay.
to me, that seems to be more important than, industry by industry, exactly,
Okay.
how much is being used. I mean, it's good to know. It's interesting information, I think, to know, like who's out there using water, but I don't know that it affects impacts.
All right. Anything else from the committee on duty 1, baseline inventory? Seems like we're all, oh, go ahead, Carrie.
And maybe you touched upon this, and you can tell me if this is a bit tangential to the question in front of us. But when you look at water usage and obviously our long-term interest to meet the needs of our future water demand that includes in-stream sources, I think it still would be helpful to look at end user water usage at the consumer level. We probably only meter a fraction of water currently, whether it's related to a public water and a well-based system in communities. But it can, I think of a long-term strategy of how we want to ensure that we can meet the future needs, whether it's snowmaking or in-stream. I think part of what we ought to be including in here as a recommendation is looking at water conservation, water management at the end user level, and whether we should be looking at a metering-based system to maximize water efficiency at the end user level.
Yep. Okay. That is one of our tasks to look at under task 3, duty 3. So we can talk about that one more if needed when we move down through. Anything else on committee or duty 1, or moving on to duty 2?
Actually, sorry, I had one other thought. For those of us who have been around a few years, we remember Act 199 of 2008, which was requirements for reporting on groundwater withdrawals and essentially registering and permitting for large volume groundwater withdrawals. And there was some I think useful forms and information that was developed by DEC's water supply division for implementing that act. And I'm actually just looking at one of the forms right now. The groundwater withdrawal system facility verification form. And so I'm just, if this is the route we're going, there may be a wheel that's at least partially invented already.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Jeff. And I have started looking at some of what the groundwater protection program's been doing around their program. So.
Okay.
Okay, moving on.
If I
Go
may,
ahead, David.
And this goes to Representative Dolan's report. I think in the exchange, it was mentioned that in fact there's an alternative analysis required under the snowmaking withdrawal program, right, Jeff? And that,
yes.
So that is something that we already, if you will, quote unquote, know how to do. Again, a wheel partially invented here in terms of if this becomes a wider analysis and involvement program.
Yeah, so, as Jeff Nelson knows, and, there is a needs and alternatives analysis under the snowmaking rules where they have to look at different storage and storage options to, try to limit the effects on the natural flow regime in our streams.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that, has been widely, adopted, and I think successful for the purposes of those types of withdrawals. I guess if we were to go that route, I think we'd have to think about tailoring that to kind of the nature of the activity and going back to John Groman's comment about, potential impacts. I mean, if you're talking about, one sprinkler nozzle for irrigating a field of strawberries, doing a, major alternatives analysis and going through, a lot of process like that is probably not worthwhile or particularly beneficial, I would say.
Right. Yeah, I think it'd be a threshold of, what your projected use quantity would be. Yeah. Okay, anything else on 1, or ready to move on to 2? So the second duty is recommend whether or not surface water transfers between watersheds should occur. I don't know if Jeff, do you want to start on it? Jeff Melton, do you want to start?
Sure. We think that with the appropriate safeguards that such transfers can occur. We think that the Killington-Pico case that we talked a little bit about previously, where concerns were raised, particularly by Fish and Wildlife, about potential for pathogens and invasives, aquatics to get from one watershed to another, were addressed in a manner that enabled the agency to issue a 401 certification that the project would meet water quality standards both in the donor and receiver basins. So I think that showed to me that, at least in the context of a 401, that the agency has the tools and capability to put protections in place so that this is, able to be regulated in a manner that protects waters in accordance with the water quality standards. So I think, David Dean, we had a conversation, I don't know if it was last time or 2 times ago about, I guess it was last time about, well, you were arguing that you didn't need a 401, and he's right. But because that was because of the nature of the 404 permit that may or may not have been required. But, clearly we have the opportunity here to make a recommendation. And if the recommendation is that whoever you is, if you want to do an interbasin transfer, you need to get, it may not be exactly called a 401 if there's no federal license or permit triggered, but you have to get some kind of permit / certification / blessing from ANR that this project will meet the water quality standards, both in the donor and the receiver basins. I think that would make sense.
Evan?
Yeah, I guess I had a number of comments and questions in there. I got, what is the definition of a surface water transfer or interbasin transfers? And Jeff touched on that as well. I think a lot of my comments were, I think, echoing what we're all aware of in this process, which is, we're kind of focused on hydrology processes at an appropriate scale, because really that's what we're talking about is, how much volume it is proposed to be removed or transferred, and how does that, compare to the setting or the scale of the removal or receiving water. And I just, with that in mind, I just made a few points like that, depending on what scale you're concerned about, there are already lots of these quote unquote transfers that we see all over the landscape. And they may not be, traditional withdrawals, but there's manipulation on the landscape that changes the route of water flow all over the place, roadways, agricultural ditches. And, if you think about some of these settings where those manipulations have occurred over the decades or hundreds of years, some of them are probably quite impactful. You know, if you think about a big ditching project in a, you know, quote unquote headwaters agricultural setting, I've seen, you know, being out in the field, seeing some of these areas, they can divert, you know, a significant drainage area from one water, you know, quote unquote watershed to another, and might be more impactful than a bigger withdrawal on a bigger river system, you know.
Mhm.
So I just think I'm trying to emphasize that the scale really matters here, and I think we all know that, and we're all focused on hydrology, the hydrology basis of this, but those were the kind of thrust of my comments.
Okay. John, David?
David, why don't you take it?
Yep, you're on mute, David. You're on mute, David.
Here.
There you go.
There we go. Okay. When I read your comments about water moving between quote unquote watersheds and at the smaller landscape scales that we manipulate water around Vermont, I tended to agree with you. Our concern was that the Killington situation, which it did in fact work out reasonably well, was the first time that we meaning the state of Vermont, had transferred water in major basins between the Connecticut and the Champlain Basin, between Long Island Sound and the St. Lawrence, you know, basin. And the whole notion was that it was a huge scale that involved small streams. And that was why some of us really wanted to explore further, because as our comments point out, there's no authority for the agency to establish standards for water withdrawals and none for interbasin transfers. And we've touched on that discussion throughout this meeting, but I just wanted to make clear that it's the large basins that are of concern. And one example, although it's no longer true, smallmouth bass, black bass, are native to the Champlain Basin. They are not native to the Connecticut River Basin. Now, they've been introduced and they're an established wild species in our Connecticut River Basin. But suppose you were doing a transfer between the basins for the very first time. Is it a good idea to transfer a new species like that? So that was the question. And ditching roads and what we've done in terms of stormwater control and moving things from this sub watershed basin to that one because it has more capacity. That seems reasonably comfortable. It was the big scale that was of concern.
And I guess just jumping in, and that was why in my comments I had made reference to kind of these larger overall watersheds, and I've been thinking about that a bit more, and Jeff sort of thinking about the HUC 6 designations for watersheds that USGS uses, and I think they actually have Vermont divided into 5 basins, just because of, and I was looking at this a little earlier, and I'll send this out to the committee afterwards, but if we use the HUC 6 categories of basins as the basis from which to look at, transfers from one basin to another, that's at least consistent with, USGS naming protocol and how they have, that report that I sent around to the group kind of spoke to that. And if you zoomed in on Vermont, you could actually count that there were 5 sub Huck 6 basin in Vermont. Anyway, I agree with David. I think that it just seems like, to me, that feels like the right level to be focused at this point.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Be those large transfers of water. Any other thoughts on this? Yep, Carrie.
Yes, thank you. I did notice, Jeff, that we had forgotten poor men from Magog, so so I think it was important to
Yes.
help identify that as one of our larger basins. But I do want to say that I've had conversations with the chair of our committee, and we were actually thinking of more on a watershed scale. I do acknowledge the concern that we all have about scale and what would be the appropriate scale. And certainly an important step would be looking at cross basin type of transfer. And the one that we recently had licensed, had permitted, did two things. So certainly cross basin, but across smaller watersheds. This is an important opportunity from my perspective to not think so limited, not to be so limited in our thinking, to really determine how do we think about this very question at a watershed scale, not necessarily at a basin scale. And I think that was the intent of when you read the language further throughout the bill, the law that was passed. That was our expo. I wanted to just clarify that. We may have a different type of approach or a different set of tools or perspectives on how we look at types of projects that may be proposed in sometime in the future. But this is an important opportunity for us to be thinking more broadly about inner watershed transfer.
Okay, thank you. When you're thinking inner watershed transfer, you're thinking at all scales or the scales of, like the Winooski to Memorial watershed? I'm just trying to clarify what level, or is it, the small watersheds to watersheds as well?
I think part of this conversation is to try to put perhaps some recommendations forward. Mm-hmm. I think we weren't trying to predetermine what that scale would be, but I think it's helpful for us to be thinking about it in a scale that would help us address some of the potential transfers that can occur at a watershed basis. We've all seen this already being proposed. I recall one project being proposed that was envisioning moving water from, certainly it was all within Lake Champlain Basin, but it was moving water from one part of the lake and then discharging it into a river system. And that would have presented with us a number of challenges, not just the hydrologic response within the receiving water, but also the potential of the transfer of nuisance species. So I just wanted to just not limit ourselves. Jeff, as his point is well taken, and same with David Dean, his comment about basin transfer, but we should try to at least take advantage of this opportunity to kind of look at it at a broader perspective.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else with thoughts on this duty? Probably we can move on here to duty 3, which is identify whether the state of Vermont should develop and implement a statewide permitting program, permitting or regulatory regime for diversions or other transfers of surface water, including the scale or size of the watershed to regulate how the permanent program would comply with Vermont water quality standards, and how or if permitting programs should address the impacts of diversion on groundwater, and how to address reducing the demand for water through water recycling and reuse. We probably take these one by one to the extent people have thoughts on them. I can go first. I mean, I think in general, the agency and the DEC has identified that there is a regulatory gap, and in that there is no permitting program for surface water diversions in the state, which has left, leaves potentially some activities out there that could affect our waters unregulated. And, I think in general, we would like to see the gap be filled at some level. David?
Yeah, I would just point out that we've had a discussion about under this, the scale of size of a watershed. I said we were interested in large, others are interested in smaller, and unless we're prepared to resolve that, I would suggest we pass over that.
Okay, we can do that.
And then, of course, a permitting program has to comply with the water quality standards. That's why we put them in place and made them boss. So that, and I would just want to make sure that that's clear, that in fact the water quality standards are the standards that we are talking about. In terms of groundwater, I don't see it as being useful other than as a role model, if you will, as Jeff suggested earlier, in terms of the forms and the thinking that went into developing that registration and tracking program and how we do it in Vermont. But coupling surface and groundwater withdrawals, neither we nor the Vermont citizen legislature have enough time to work our way through the intricacies of the connection between ground and surface water in and out. I mean, it's, and so I think John and I are both in the same place on this, that let's deal with surface water, which is the charge, or the primary charge of this committee. And then in our thinking about this whole issue, we came on a consideration, a perspective. You're a water user, okay? Whether you're agriculture or your business, you're a brewery or whatever, and you're using surface water, and suddenly we hit a drought situation. How do we work that out? And under Vermont statute and case law, it's our riparian water user reasonable use standard, which, depending on the age of the court case, can mean being able to float saw logs in a spring freshet to the depth of the water where you're duck hunting. And so it's not well defined. And if your business or interests rely on access to water, and suddenly it's not there because someone upstream has decided to take it all out, what do you do? And that was, and so the protection for water users was something that we wanted to bring to the conversation.
Yeah, I would just add, and I don't know, people seem frozen to me. I don't know if there's, if everybody's seeing that Carrie looks frozen and Jeff Crocker looks frozen. But I'm hoping that they can still hear. But I agree with what David said. I agree with Jeff Crocker that we see the gap that exists, and that we need, we think that it's important for this group to take steps to close that gap. So we have, just as we've been talking about, a jurisdictional threshold that's going to assure that activities comply with the water quality standards when there is reasonable belief that those activities are at a scale that could result in violations of the water quality standards and adverse impacts on our waters. We would like to, as David said, have some. We've been talking with some experts in this idea of riparian regulation and the use issue, and we'd like to bring them to the committee and have them go through their thinking on this, the work that they've done studying this issue, to put that on the table so we could have that as part of the mix.
You say the next meeting, John? You kind of tailed off there. You're on mute.
David,
now.
yeah, sorry about
Oh,
that.
there you go.
So David, I don't know what next meeting hasn't been scheduled yet, but I assume that we could
We'll
contact
go.
someone. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's still one of the last agenda items, is to
Okay.
kind of work through the schedule and talk about transitioning into in-person if people feel comfortable, and
Mhm.
locations, and potentially longer time periods, since our time is starting to get short.
Yep.
So yeah. So we can maybe table that until we get to the.
No, we
that
would make it
point.
work. Your time is getting short, as you said. So
Yeah.
we would, that people can zoom in. Obviously, that would be great. Still, so these folks are, a couple of them are from out of state. So
Yeah, we'll have to.
Yeah.
Technology challenges.
Right.
We'll have to work through those. Senator Bray.
Yeah, so thank you all. And I have to go to my next meeting. So I know I'm leaving this topic in great hands. I'll catch up to you at the next meeting, and maybe in between by phone. Right. Thanks you all. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.
See you, Senator.
Evan.
Yeah. So I guess it's been a number of years actually since I've been walking streams for doing geomorphic assessments. I used to do a lot of that work, and there just aren't as many of those projects happening these days. But I definitely, in my years of walking streams, especially smaller streams, and seeing withdrawals on those streams that were pretty significant and likely unregistered, unpermitted, significant relative to the scale of the stream itself. There's not much doubt in my mind that there are withdrawals that impact, that are currently impacting streams. I guess I do wonder just how pervasive they are, and how much of a problem this really is. When I look at the inventory that you provided, Jeff, at the beginning, I think our first meeting, there's a total of 104 data points. That's not very much. And there are probably many times that out there. We just don't know, how many and how big of withdrawals each one are, and most importantly, how big they are relative to the size of the stream. Just to double back a little bit on the scale piece, I think we all agree that whether you're withdrawing from one sub-watershed to another sub-watershed, or watershed to another watershed, or basin to another basin, however you define that scale, you know, we're concerned with, I think, the low end of the flow spectrum, right? And whether that withdrawal is removing enough water. I hadn't thought much, honestly, about the like the possibility of invasive species introduction. So that's kind of a new twist in my mind. But you know, from basic hydrology, I think we're mostly concerned about removing those situations where enough water is removed that we're taking away, you know, more base flow than should be taken away, and threatening aquatic biology, essentially. So in my mind, it almost doesn't matter, you know, again, the scale piece, whether you're sort of what your context is, as much as the volume and the proportion. So yeah, those were. Let's look at my other thoughts here. I had a number of questions, and Jeff, you mentioned a few things about, like, you know, if there were the need for a regulatory approach on some of these withdrawals, like what is the burden of the applicant relative to the proposal? You know, is an alternatives analysis needed? I'd be interested in knowing how this is handled in other states. Like, is there sort of a tiered approach where, you know, smaller withdrawals are sort of get by with some basic information, whereas the bigger ones, you know, really need to provide that proof. I think that was mostly what I had.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I think, you know, the large, you know, snowmaking, you know, there's a needs alternatives analysis, but there has been, you know, other Act 250 withdrawals that typically wouldn't have to go through such a rigorous, you know, analysis for their use. You know, I can think of, maybe it was like over at the Neshabie golf course, where they have, you know, they withdraw from the stream. You know, they have to make sure it's above the certain conservation flow level. They withdraw, and then they report those withdrawings annually to us. But from my understanding, there wasn't like a large, like, needs alternatives analysis for that particular water withdrawal.
Actually, I did just have one other thought I want to share. I thought it would be good to, after this inventory or registration process is done, you know, whether it's a year or two from now, whatever it is, if A&R could compile the results of that and kind of make sense of the data in some sort of report, and provide some statistics by basin that could help everybody understand, you know, what the relative quote unquote impacts are in each basin, sub-watershed. That, you know, that would be really interesting to know, because then if there are differences in the context of each watershed, you know, we're in a small state, but we do see different climate differences, and precipitation and hydrology differences across the state. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. You know, see that data in a publicly available, you know, report.
Yeah. Jeff, thoughts?
Sure. So I just kind of echoing what I wrote in our written filing. You know, we think that a registration process, I'm interested to hear what New Hampshire DES is doing currently, but something along those lines to get a handle on existing withdrawals that are out there, much in the same way that was done for groundwater withdrawals a number of years ago, as I mentioned earlier. We think that if that evolves into some kind of a permit program, that nothing should be done to upset the snowmaking rule and process that currently is in place. We've worked very hard to ensure that that's protective and that it's a known and understandable process, both for the industry and the public and the agency and other interested parties. And, and it is, as you mentioned earlier, the only type of water withdrawal in Vermont that is, currently comprehensively regulated. And, to Dave Dean's comment a short time ago, what happens when there's a drought? Well, we know what happens in the case of a drought for a skier if they stop taking water. I mean, they're not able to just keep taking water no matter how low the flow goes. So, those are the kinds of protections that, depending on what the inventory from the registration were to reveal, may need to be looked at for some of these other kinds of withdrawals as well. But we think that, and I've said this in my testimony in the State House when this bill was being considered, but I have to keep saying it, that the snowmaking rule and the process should be respected because it is something that's working.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, I'd agree that the snowmaking rules are working well, and I think the agency and the ski resorts and NGOs, I think it's served us well over the years.
I mean, there are some things we'd like to change if we could, but maybe not the same things that others would like.
Right, right.
Yeah, therein lies the problem. That's why we leave it alone, right?
That's right. That's exactly right.
Carrie?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Jeff. I too think that that's not necessarily take this process to mess with something that's currently working. So I appreciate that comment. And I also just wanted to mention that here's an opportunity for us, a couple of things. One is that here's an opportunity for us to learn from other states, and I appreciate you mentioning New Hampshire. I know that the Western states are under appropriative water laws, not necessarily riparian. However, when they've regulated surface water withdrawal, farmers have moved to groundwater withdrawal, and now they're in a situation of overconsumption of their groundwater. And so we ought to recognize, again, I know it's hard for us with this process to think more broadly about water availability, but there's a connection there, as we know, between groundwater recharge and the river health. And we just want to make sure that what we come up with is a process that's not going to drive us to regulated, or because agriculture is oftentimes exempt from activities. We want to be careful about not driving a process to a more unregulated water use, such as on groundwater, that can result in more ecological damage from preventing recharge or overconsumption of water in an unregulated way. So I just wanted to kind of mention that. I also know out west where they've diverted waters to such an extent that their river restoration is restored under a different geomorphic, and again, I that worries me. And again, recognizing why it is we should be looking at not just basin at the watershed scale. And I appreciate the comments from Evan Fitzgerald about that. It is all about scale, and there's probably a de minimis issue out there, and we are looking at where we have weather conditions and usage conditions in such a way that we're seeing significant impact. So I wanted to make that point. And my final point is something I'm very interested to see if somehow maybe you already have had done this. As the Killington had gone through that permitting process through a 401, what were those? And can we learn from that process at all? Was there something that was wanting, fell short? What it is we're trying to accomplish here as a state moving forward, and learn from that process. So Jeff, I really look forward to hearing from you too, and from that one project that we all just experienced to see how can we use that as a lessons learned for our own state.
Thank you. Ryan or Jason, do you have any thoughts on duty 3?
No, I mean, at this time, I guess I don't really have much to add.
Okay.
So,
Ryan?
Sure, thanks. Carrie, or Representative Dolan, sorry. Your comments raised for me something I've been trying to understand as far as the scale and potential impact. We look to the West, and obviously a brittle environment needs lots of irrigation to be able to grow crops. As I mentioned in some of my opening comments, Vermont suffers from, even though we have these episodic droughts, crop insurance claims far and away are for too much water from damaging crops. And so looking to the state of Vermont, right, 12% of Vermont's land is in agriculture, 73% forested, 8% in wetlands and other vegetation. So we got 94% of the state of Vermont providing, recharge. Obviously agriculture can be a withdrawer and user of either surface waters or groundwaters, but there is a recharge cycle. Not all of that is used. Some of it's used very efficiently, but eventually those feeds are harvested, fed to cows, and manure is returned to cropland. So it's a longer cycle, but liquid manure, as we all know, is about 97% water when it goes on the field, hence the challenges with water quality. But my broader point is based on the 2018 USDA irrigation survey, which in some ways complements the 2017 data. It provides a bit more information there about total water used for irrigation on farms, both on-farm surface water as well as groundwater withdrawals. And based on my conversions of acre feet to gallons, it looks like, and then I was referencing that helpful document that VLS put together that Mason shared last time we met. It looks like agriculture in Vermont withdraws about 355 million gallons, which apparently is about as much as, not to point Okemo out, but just as, that one water user in that one watershed is permitted to withdraw between 350 and 450 million gallons. Now, I don't know, that's just based on that report. So across the whole state of Vermont, we're looking at a potential 355 million gallon withdrawal, and water users are distributed across every county. No one county has more than 14% of the total farms in the state. And so, not saying that a farm, as Evan was speaking to, a lot of this is situationally dependent, right? Some very small tributaries you're not going to be able to withdraw from, or you'll have a very, very low allowance, and farmers would have to look to other sources or methods to grow crops and collect water, et cetera, et cetera. But that's where I think kind of the de minimis question in the current regulatory understanding, I think, works well. And I think Vermont, we've lost 225,000 acres of agriculture in Vermont since 1987. So we definitely have downwardly trending agricultural land use and a scale of use in the state that I don't think is anywhere on par with California's water diversion challenges or the Ogallala aquifer issues we see out in the West. Not to say this couldn't be studied or understood better, but I don't know if the threat that folks see from the West is borne out when looking at that high-level data available for Vermont.
Thank you.
May I follow up with that, Jeff?
Certainly.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Ryan. I really it's really helpful to have your perspective, and I appreciate you putting it in that context. I only want to flag a couple of things, if I may. typically agriculture irrigation demand is usually during a drier season. It's our growing season, and it may be more vulnerable to drought. And number one. Number two is we want to support agriculture, and as you know, and we want to support especially the opportunities for agriculture to diversify or for local foods. We know the huge health benefits of that, as well as cultural and our whole societal benefits of supporting local agriculture. And so as we potentially see more and more local foods, as we hope to see more and more local foods grown in the state, there's a potential of seeing more irrigation, or more need for irrigation, or more need for continuity or consistency of water supply. And so, and then on top of that, we, as you know, we just are promoting with the cannabis bill an opportunity, an agricultural opportunity to encourage a whole industry that is a type of crop that is water dependent. And so I only want to make the point that this is information where we are status today is important, but we ought to be thinking about not necessarily I guess my point is, how do we think about those issues in the future? And are there a way in which we can promote or incentivize, as part of recommendations perhaps, with your perspective and input, a set of maybe technical standards that would promote water efficiency uses in agriculture, so that we can avoid the kind of crisis and then trying to promote water efficiency irrigation practices, for example? How can we just have that right up front, right when we see a greater demand for irrigation? How do we promote greater efficiencies for that use? Similarly, I like to see, we might not have all the answers in this report, I'd like to see the end user have, how do we promote and incentivize water efficiency at the end user, at the more the residential user or the commercial industrial use? Again, not only is there energy benefit from that, because more efficiency could reduce the energy uses from pumping to irrigation, but it's also a resource management strategy across the board. So I only want to make that point as a follow-up for our discussion that we've had on this issue. So thank you.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, so I want to read. Obviously I didn't get a chance to read what Ryan sent. We just got it, and I listened to what he said, and I like to think about what he said and listen to it again. But what I think I heard is that statistics related to the amount of water resources we have in the state and the amount of farms we have in the state, and going back to what I said before, I mean, I think, and it was the same when we talked about the groundwater program. It's every situation is different in my mind, and it depends on the withdrawal, whatever the use is, whether it's a farm or another kind of use. What's the characteristics of the water resources where the water is coming from? How much water is being taken? What are the other uses of water from that source, and what are the impacts vis-a-vis the water quality standards? So to me, that's the issue we're trying to deal with. Going back to what Evan said before, when he was walking streams, you see withdrawals, some of them may be having an impact. It's so dependent, and it's that. I think that's the challenge that we have to meet, is basically crafting protections that address that. So that's my initial reaction. I just wanted to put that on the table, but as we continue to debate this.
All right. Thank you. Anyone else on duty 3? Thoughts? Hearing none. Duty 4 or 5 and
My only comment,
Carrie.
it's just a short, brief comment, but I really appreciate what Evan had mentioned about tiering, because obviously And as what John had just said, not one size fits all in terms of what we anticipate down the road. And the idea behind a tiered approach based on size, magnitude, scale, I think there's some merit to looking at that. So I only throw that out as something that I thought that was a thoughtful comment on Evan's part that I think has some merit here.
Okay, thank you. Any other thoughts on duty 3? Okay. It strikes me duty 4. Sorry, go ahead. Yep.
Thank you for your patience. I guess the one comment about the water efficiency at the end use, I'm a kind of broken record here, but I don't know what the baseline is for that. I mean, do we require metering for water use? And if we do, where? And I presume that some water systems out there that are public water systems do, because they're paying by demand. And it's a ratepayer based payment system. So I presume that our special ed municipality, larger municipalities have metering. But it'd be interesting to know that because I think metering would be an element of that kind of technological approach towards looking at water conservation at the end user level.
My understanding is a lot of the public, I think more from public water systems do have some metering required. And when you're in those contexts, they may require, conservation water measures be taken. I think I saw in the paper today, maybe it was the Champlain Lake or the water district is implementing conservation measures, or at least telling customers they should, be careful, efficient with the water that they're using, given some of the conditions. So, I think those are in effect. Matt?
I was just going to add, I think that the meter data is very dependent upon the size and sophistication of the facility that you're dealing with. And I think that based on what I know, the majority of public water systems do not have meter data. But the big ones do, right? Like, so Champlain Water System and others do. And I think unfortunately it's also more complicated than that because of some of the structure of how some of these water systems exist. So.
Yeah, I know for a fact that the Westminster Aqueduct Society does not meter its water.
Okay.
Well, and I know that the Tri-Town Water District in Addison does, because I get a bill based on my meter.
Jason?
Yeah, I think metering is critical because we should be making regulations and decisions based on data-driven parameters. And I don't think it doesn't seem like it would be a huge undertaking to meter the same as you have to meter groundwater withdrawal or, other water usages to meter surface water withdrawal either. And to me, that seems like a pretty baseline expectation to make data-driven decisions, and as we progress into the future, be able to look back at data and see any changes. And it's really hard to do that if you have no realistic idea of how much is being withdrawn and when and what time of years. Are there certain peaks and valleys? So to me, that would be a baseline minimum requirement, is that surface water withdrawals need to be metered and reported.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? Moving on to duties 4 and 5 and 6. It strikes me, first one's analyze potential viable regimes to address the use of surface water in Vermont. I think, we've talked about registration program. We could get other state programs in here, talk about their programs of how they regulate surface water diversions. Do other people have thoughts on 4? I think duties 5 and 6 may be a little bit premature to discuss, but
Agreed.
maybe 4, just to kind of what people need and additional information, comments, or thoughts on this duty.
I think the one thing that we need to think about regarding number 4 is you sort of, in my mind, and I think we dealt with this with the groundwater withdrawals, there's sort of 2 populations here. There's the population of existing water withdrawals, people that have been going about doing this stuff for whatever period of time. And, obviously we know the ski areas are regulated, they meter it and report it and so forth, but then you have others that don't. But then you have sort of the future and what, for increased water withdrawals and new water withdrawals, what's the process going to be for those entities? And in my mind, they're 2 different things because I guess, where you have something that's existing, they've been doing it for whatever years. It would seem to me that unless there is a demonstration that that activity is causing a violation of the water quality standards, it would be pretty unreasonable for this process to result in them no longer being able to do what they've been doing, whether it's a drinking water system or a golf course or a farm or what have you. So I sort of feel like we've got to figure out the buckets. And if it's a bucket of existing uses that has some, sort of baseline of acceptability and then standards for going forward for expanded or new withdrawals. And, some of that I think we dealt with in the snowmaking rule to some extent. So there might be some analogs there, but just a thought.
Okay. Anyone else? Evan, John?
I don't have anything more on this particular one at this
Yeah,
point.
me neither.
Okay. David?
Yeah, I agree with the analysis that many people wrote that 4, 5, and 6 are we have got to get to them, and we've got to get to them soon, but not yet. I think there's some things we want to hear about from other jurisdictions and how it's going and how we might pull that together based on what we hear. So I tend to agree that make sure that we have these scheduled for future meetings so that we can begin to take them up and maybe reach some kind of understanding of where the committee stands. I have some logistics questions, but I'll wait until later. That sort of relate to this, but I'll wait.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this before we move to, I want to talk a little bit about the schedule and ask people about their comfortable transition back into in-person meetings and locations and anything else relating to the duties before we move to the next item.
I'm good.
Okay. Hearing none. Oh, David, sorry.
One of the things that we included in our written response, and I wanted to make sure that we at least touched on it in this meeting, and that is for an education program. And it was almost touched on, I think, earlier by Representative Dolan in her conversation about shifting use in appropriate or inappropriate ways. And we, John and I were like to hear quickly, a brief presentation from the Lakewise program, which is out there making sense for owners of lakeshore property for the Shoreland Protection Act. And as I understand it, it's been successful. People like it. People participate. There are people that get they give an award, a gold disc or a star or something like that.
You get a sign.
I'm sorry?
They get the sign that says their property meets the criteria.
And so just a quick presentation from them to see if that's something that, we could build into whatever, and presuming we do forward something to the legislature.
Okay, so you would like to hear from that program and how it works in terms of potentially developing a similar education program for around water withdrawals?
Right. How long did it take them to set it up? How did their outreach go? This is what, 4 or 5 years later from when they started it?
Something like that.
What's the timing on that? What might we expect from a similar kind of program?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Anyone else have comments on the duties before we move on to our meeting schedule? Okay. Hearing none. I wanted to touch base with the committee, with 80% vaccination rate reached across the state, discuss people's are comfortable, being in person again, meeting, and we could probably meet in Montpelier, either at the National Life Building or another state office. We'll have to look at some of the IT setup, make sure we have, Teams and for Zoom or whatever for people who want to patch in or speakers who want to patch in. But just throwing it out there, whether this is a time that the committee study group feels comfortable coming to in-person meetings.
Well, I guess I'll jump in. I am 100% comfortable with in-person, and I really feel that we could have better discussion in person. It's hard. Sometimes you don't hear everybody, and I find looking at screen, heads on the screen gets a little old after a while. So I would be 100% in favor of doing that. But I also think that, given that there'll be times when it's difficult for one or more of us to get to Montpelier, that having the ability to still call in or Zoom in or whatever, would be really helpful as well. But I would really like to be able to get together in person if we as a group felt okay doing that.
I completely agree with Jeff Nelson, and I love when I'm able to say that.
I love that too.
I've recorded every time I get to say that, and I just kind of have it on a loop. And I'm gonna get my kid to put auto tunes to it, and maybe it'll go viral. And then I think Jeff said it really well, and I think it's going to be needed to just complete the task to have those in-person conversations. Just tricky technical stuff that we need to resolve.
Yeah, what he said.
The technical stuff's what worries me.
I don't know about the agreeing or disagreeing with Jeff, but I totally in the past, but I agree with Jeff now.
So are others on the committee, are they feeling comfortable? We'll start hopefully hold the next meeting in person. We'll have a call-in option, I guess, as well, for those who need it. But we can work out those tasks.
So what are we looking at for a time frame, Jeff, for trying to do this?
So I'm looking at, let's see, where are we at here? Potentially the week of the July 12th or July 19th, for people's availability. I would like to also throw out, I think if we're all driving to Montpelier, or those that of us are, we may want to chunk out a larger block than 2 hours. We can have breaks and just to try to, kind of move this forward along. I think there's been some guests that have been identified for the next meeting. So, we may have like a guest and then pick up a discussion for a bit and then have another guest, or something like that. So we may be blocking out more than 2 hours. I'm not sure what people's thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I really agree that we should, if we're going to get this done, we're going to need a longer than 2 hour chunks. And I don't know if the agency could do this, Jeff, but it would be really helpful to kind of like with the few meetings, like kind of map out like a timeline of like kind of what we have to accomplish and kind of back out of it, because at some point we're going to have drafts, right? Like there'll be like drafts and we have to review drafts and then we have to talk about language and kind of to get to that point, what does that look like? And yeah, if you guys could sketch that out and that could inform the length of the meetings, I think. Does that make sense?
All right. That makes sense, John. You're on mute, Carrie.
How does the week of the 26th work? Does
that works
better for me that week, July 26th that week?
Yes, same here.
I'm available that week as well.
Yeah,
Fine.
likewise. I'm actually taking 2 weeks to travel from the 12th to the 23rd, so those weeks are not good for me.
Okay.
But the week of the 26th is.
Yes, it is good for me.
Do we have a particular day that's better for most? I know some people have standing meetings on Mondays that.
I could only meet Monday that week and maybe Friday. I'll be away. The other days that week.
Monday's good.
Monday works for me.
Monday's
Fine.
Any conflicts on Monday for other members? All right. None. What?
the only conflict I have.
Sorry, go ahead, Carrie.
I'm available after noon on Monday.
Yeah, afternoon is better for me.
I have 11.
Okay. Do we want to do the whole afternoon on Monday? We'll plan to meet in Montpelier, starting at 1. And
1 to 4.
Yeah, and I can set up. I'll get you all the members' details of where and what room it potentially. I'm looking at National Life, using some of that office space, unless others have. Matt, do you have?
I was just going to say the Catamount, just so you know, Jeff, Catamount set up for basically it's been retrofitted for Teams. So
Okay.
And I've got an invite out. I'll forward it to you, and you can forward it around.
All right, thank you, Matt. So yeah, it'd be at the National Life building in Montpelier. From 1 to 4 on the 26th.
I just want to go back for a moment to something John Groman just said, to say, number one, I completely agree with John, that we should, we have our deadline.
Cut it out, you guys.
This is great. We got to stop the meeting right now. Just like I'm just going to end Teams. Where's the button?
Of December 15th of this year, and I think that backing up from that of a first draft and a meeting to review the draft, and I don't know, I think we just need to get some steps that make sure that we're going to be able to meet that deadline and have enough time in between, you know, I don't know how many steps we need to have, but maybe there needs to be an outline and then, you know, a meeting and I don't know. I think we gotta flesh that out a bit.
And I think as part of that, as part of that, is one of my threshold questions about logistics is who's going to write? You know,
David.
David.
I assume it's coming from the agency.
Yeah, I assumed I would have the primary writer.
But I assume that's why Matt Chapman was on.
Too.
I thought Chapman was on the call, you know, because he's going to write the whole thing. That was just what I assumed, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, there he is. So he's ready to go. I see his thumbs up. Oh, no, he's saying no. All right, okay.
Well, I do hope that, in fact, the agency is going to, Jeff, it's not like he does not have other things to do.
Yeah.
No, I think obviously it's going to be a group effort. I mean, one of the things I guess I would just put out there, and I think Jeff and I will probably get together, is to try and come up with an outline of sort of what the issues are. It seems to me, just listening to your conversation, there are some things that are relatively easy, and it seems like people are in agreement on them. And it seems like if we spent some time and knocked those out and got formal agreement amongst the committee, then Jeff and I could start putting pen to paper. Whereas it seems like there are some other things that are less defined and might need additional discussion, and sort of just identifying those and figuring out what we need to talk about and how we can reach some consensus around those particular issues, or define what the disagreement is, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So in answer to my process question, in fact, the agency will be doing the drafts and providing it to the committee. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions, comments? I think one thing I heard from David and well, I can reach out as I try to formulate a schedule here for the next meeting about, you know, getting some states in and a couple of these other people, try to figure out the schedule going forward.
Do we, I know we talked some about folks from other jurisdictions to talk about the programs that they administer. And then I think, John, you had a guest in mind as well, or two, maybe two. I'm just trying to think about who it is that we want to hear from next.
Yeah, I had on my list New Hampshire DES, my colleague counterpart over in New Hampshire. They will come in and speak at our next one.
I guess, you know, I was looking again at the VLS report, and they had identified Minnesota, Massachusetts, and Florida, of all places, as having the three most, I'm not sure what the word, robust programs. And, you know, I don't know if, I mean, you know, if it's too much to load up into the agenda, whether also hearing from someone from Minnesota or Massachusetts, I guess I would opt from one of those northern tier states as opposed to Florida, just given some of the other similarities we have. But is that too much to try to cover, you know, hear two different speakers on how different states are doing things at the same meeting?
I think it'd be great to hear multiple perspectives. I mean, I think if it's possible. And you tell us, you know, we have three different experts who have studied some of the regulatory and legal constructs around these issues. We don't have to bring them all in if there's not time. I think there's at least two, David, right, that we like to that have slightly differing perspectives on it. So, but you let us know, Jeff, what do you think is reasonable? We could bring at least the two in, and they wouldn't be I don't think they would be incredibly long presentations.
Right, and they would not physically be in. They would probably be via Teams or whatever. And then in terms of the Lake Coast program, or I'm sorry, Lakewise program, I mean, they're right there in the building, right? And they could wander down for 15 minutes and,
Yeah, I can
at least
talk
give
to
us
Amy.
just a framework of how they did it.
Yeah, I can talk to Amy Peacock and ask her availability.
Yeah, I don't mean to jam the meeting up either, but I think a quick presentation like that would be easy to deal with.
Okay. I can check her availability. Any other thoughts?
So we are tasked with having, is it 6 meetings?
Yes. Yeah. At least.
If we, at least, yeah, I was gonna say, if we felt we needed an extra 1 or 2 to get to December 15th, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. We just have to work the schedule and try to fit it in, but I mean, if we're gonna, it sounds like we may spend the most, if not all, of the next meeting. I mean, if we potentially have 5 guests, 2 different states, the Lakewise person, and then these 2 legal experts that John mentioned, that's 5 people. That's gonna take up probably most of the afternoon. I mean, we may have time to have some discussion in between some of those, but that's a lot to cover.
Yeah.
In one meeting. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm just thinking that it's going to take up pretty much the whole afternoon, I would guess.
Yeah. Maybe.
Well, that was one of the other things, and I thought that issue had been resolved, but 2-hour meetings aren't going to get us to the product we need by the date we need it. So I agree, that's a heavy agenda, Jeff, but I think we're just going to have to do it.
Yeah, I'm good with it.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
I only want to point out that Mason's comment in the chat recommending Minnesota be added
Okay. I didn't
As
see
a-
that. Thank you.
second state.
All right. I can reach out to Minnesota as well.
And they had a lower threshold, as I recall, was 10,000. So, that would be interesting to hear how they came up with that, and if that varies based on the river or stream system, and, so I think that would be good.
All right. Okay. Anyone else? Well, thank you all. I'm going to send out this meeting invite right now for the July 26th. And we'll see you in 3D hopefully soon.
Okay.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jeff.
All right.
You
Thanks,
may
everybody.
have to send it again. Some of us lose things.
I'll send it to you, David. Well, actually, you'll be in person. You don't need it. Just.
Thanks all. Bye.
Yep,
Thank
bye.
you.